Why Asean is never going to be an Asian NATO. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and given what's just happened in Myanmar, I want to discuss the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. ASEAN is a group of all the countries of the Southeast Asian region. I won't list them all off here, but they include big countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, but also smaller ones like Cambodia. And that entire region is a multilateral body that talks about its shared interests and affairs, mostly trade, territorial issues, South China Sea, a very important body to discuss matters of shared interest in this critical area of the world in which the majority of the world's trade flows through. It has the Malacca Straits. And yet these countries are very different in their outlooks and priorities. And there has been an attempt over decades to make ASEAN more of a supranational body, something that has a kind of an EU-like function with governance that stretches across these different territories. But this is never going to happen. ASEAN is supposed to be a body that is purely by consensus. It's caught up with all the sort of the Asian ways of diplomacy and doing business. So there's a lot of face saving. Things are very kind of positive. Complicated or sensitive issues tend to be minimized. There's a lot of focus on what is, possible and positive and can be done together, and also a lot of status in being an ASEAN diplomat and being a representative to ASEAN. So there's a strong focus on the sort of duchessing elements, the protocols, the honorifics, that sort of way of doing it. So it's a very ceremonial body, much more so than a serious governing body. But it has been persistently the objective of Western countries to turn ASEAN into some kind of anti-China alliance. And I just want to have a brief discussion as to why that's never going to happen. First and foremost, not all Southeast Asian countries see eye to eye on these issues. There is a high degree of alignment among sort of Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines on major points of contention like the South China Sea. Although even here, Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia have conflicting territorial claims, but they do kind of want to work together to prevent China from just dredging up the entire South China Sea and building new military bases all over the place. But as an ASEAN body, which would be the only group large enough to kind of stand up to China, there is no consensus. And one of the biggest criticisms is Cambodia's relationship with China. So Cambodia is playing a sort of a double game. Cambodia's government is a highly dictatorial, oppressive regime that has been in power for many, many years. And they are run almost entirely on Chinese money. There is a town, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it correctly, Sikahhaville or something like that. It's a very long word. Some 80 new Chinese casinos are being built in that region. Mandarin has become the lingua franca of that city, in which massive amounts of Chinese tourists, investment, infrastructure, support, well, that flows through the Cambodian government. A lot of it gets suffered off to the side and flows into the Cambodian economy, where in exchange, the Cambodian government does pretty much whatever Beijing wants. And because ASEAN is a consensus sort of body, well, they're never going to have consensus on issues that conflict with Chinese interests when you've got certain dependence within ASEAN on China. And this is true not just for Cambodia. Every single one of the ASEAN countries, their number one trading partner is China. Now, that doesn't mean that they're slavishly supportive of China. I mean, Vietnam would be the number one case in point. They've been fighting the Chinese for the last 1,000 years. But nevertheless, that is still a significant body of interest tied to China's orbit and China's One Belt, One Road initiative, the huge amount of infrastructure projects, investment that is going through the ASEAN economies from China is something that most of these countries cannot ignore. And one of the things about the Myanmar coup recently that is important to consider is the influence and impact of China. If we focus on Myanmar for a bit, Myanmar was run by a military junta for over 30 years. Then Aung San Suu Kyi won the Nobel Prize. While she was under house arrest, she couldn't obviously accept that prize at the time, and she was thought of as being this massive democratic figure who would, open up the Burma economy, foreign investment, bring in the minorities. Unfortunately, when the junta did give way to democratic reform, and it was kind of a fascinating time because most kind of reform is either a popular uprising that sort of overthrows the military control, or there's a gradual process of reform like in South Korea where things move from a militaristic state towards an open, free, fair elections. Well, in Myanmar, they just threw open the gates. They just let all the political prisoners out and they said, all right, go have elections. We're not going to be in control anymore. And even though the country was desperately poor, they all of a sudden had to decide, well, we don't even know how to do elections. We had members of Aung San Suu Kyi's political party come to Australia, and our political parties here were working on their governance. Like, okay, here's how you set up databases. Here's how you send letters to constituents. Here's how you run a democracy. So Australia did a lot of work to help in this regard. It's one of those untold stories. And all of a sudden, you had the ethnic majority in Myanmar completely crush all of the elections. And then Aung San Suu Kyi herself clearly became someone who was not interested in, a multi-ethnic, all-inclusive Myanmar kind of society. She ruled very much for the ethnic majority, and that meant that the Karens, the Rohingya, all of those continued to be oppressed. So the gloss really came off Aung San Suu Kyi as a consequence of that. But the military junta had been bankrolled by China. And one thing you could say for Aung San Suu Kyi is that she wasn't really a Chinese puppet. That one of the reasons why the military junta has rolled Aung San Suu Kyi now must certainly be in support of Chinese interests. You won't find the military junta in conflict with China in any way. Then you can also talk about the history of Indonesia, which is quite interesting. Up until sort of 1965, there was a president called Sukarno. He was a pro-communist, pro-Soviet, pro-China leader. And Britain and Australia had many conflicts with him. It's what kicked off Australia's original nuclear program when we were looking at having nuclear weapons in the early 1960s. It also led to the Malaya interventions and all kinds of challenges in Borneo. So we were in a deep series of heated competition and strategic conflict with Indonesia. But then in 1966, President Suharto took over, and in the most severe bloody purge imaginable, slaughtered all of Sukarno's supporters. Some 500,000 people were massacred. But Suharto was a friend of Australia, and that relationship remained warm until Suharto left office, and then things soured after that with Habibie when Australia had the issue with East Timor. East Timor voted for independence. It wasn't acceptable to the Indonesian military. They went in to suppress and prevent the breakaway of East Timor, and Australia was under enormous pressure to do something about it. And that led to a huge amount of tension and ultimately the East Timor intervention. So we have in Indonesia a kind of a strange democracy, but they are much more quiet when it comes to China than perhaps Vietnam, for example. So Indonesia is one of those sort of speak softly, carry a big stick type of countries. So when China starts dredging near Indonesian waters, Indonesia just sends out huge amounts of military forces and just sits there, and China tends to back off. But Indonesia isn't going to stand there and stick up for all the other Asian countries. Indonesia sees itself in a special category, given it has 250 million people, about 3 times that than the next largest ASEAN country, which would be, Vietnam or Philippines. And so these countries are wildly different languages, different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds, different governmental systems, different outlooks, strange conflicts with one another, as well as different types of relationships with China. So they are an extraordinarily disparate group. And this isn't like a shared European identity where you could kind of create a cross-governance. These have different histories and different outlooks. Thailand is very, very different to Indonesia, which is different to Vietnam, which is different to Laos. So people who are compelled to make this claim that we'll have an ASEAN-style NATO with collective defense arrangements backed by the United States are just dreaming. That will never happen. Also, the distances involved. I mean, the distance between Spain and Poland is nothing like the distance between India and Japan, okay? So although we are seeing greater cooperation from countries outside of ASEAN, like India and Japan, they're not going to be military allies. India sees itself as a massive and great civilization that will become, its own massive superpower. It doesn't really need these other countries. And Japan is never going to have warm relations with South Korea. I mean, the other collective defense arrangement that America constantly trying to make in this region is to make South Korea and Japan happen as allies. South Korea will never, ever partner with Japan against China. China exists as the Confucian mother country of Korea. Korea has been a loyal Chinese ally for 1,500 years. They have both stood shoulder to shoulder to fight the Japanese on multiple occasions. The Indian War of the 16th century, centuries before the Second World War, they despise the Japanese, and South Korea perceives its military alliance with the United States as being to deter North Korea and literally nothing else. So the idea that they're going to get, Indonesia, South Korea, India, Japan to work in this, wonderful collective defense arrangement is just pure myth. This is never going to happen. And the more energy the United States expends on this to try and create a pan-ASEAN governance and a pan-Asian NATO, the more time it's not spending on those areas where it could actually get serious dividends. So that's, hopefully an interesting kind of political overview of the ASEAN region. The ASEAN countries are fast-growing economies. It is a good way to conceptualize that region. They do at least agree that they are ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries. So they do have some degree of pan-ASEAN identity. But the nation state is the highest degree of the individual's resolution. So they don't see themselves as ASEAN. They see themselves as whatever nationality they happen to be. And ASEAN is a very loose collection of consensual countries working together on areas of shared interests, and not something that's going to discuss really complicated issues like relations with China or territorial disputes or alliances and that sort of stuff. That's not the forum for it. So hopefully that's just a kind of a brief overview that is useful for people that are interested. When they hear American leaders talk about it, an Asian NATO, just dismiss it out of hand. That will never happen. And it's an embarrassment when we hear about it, because in Asia, people laugh. People laugh really, really hard when that's raised, and it shows a depth of ignorance as to how alliances and politics and relations between nation states are actually working in this region, with mistakes that countries like China are unlikely to make. If you are wanting to know more about Southeast Asian politics, I really recommend the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. They are by far and away the most well-versed in Asian political affairs in terms of their publications and knowledge. I'll leave a link in the description down below. Kishore Mahabani was the director of public policy there. I don't know if he still is, but what I'm saying is that there are incredibly salubrious individuals who work there. and it is definitely the flagship area of academic study in this field. So do have a look at that. If you have any questions, please leave them down below, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you.